Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today I work on something light because I'm still under the weather, but the show must go on. So today we'll be testing / prototyping a new method to create random dungeon layouts. I'll explain more in detail later, but for today we're looking to move to a more instantaneous build system. To do this, we'll use a mixture of two of the hottest topics on this channel lately, grids and tiles. So grab a warm bowl of chicken noodle soup, a nice comfy pillow, and let's get to some coding. First up was drawing our tile set, which will just have the default blank space and a nice old green tile to represent our flooring / dungeons. Now before we go on, let's talk about goals. Over the course of Let's Dev as a series, I have tried many different ways to create randomly generated dungeons and terrain. They've all varied in technique, approach, and outcomes, but they've all shared one thing, that they would all build in real time. And regardless if it was a crawl technique or a push technique or some weird hybrid or offshoot, they always required more than one frame or two to fully generate. So the goal today is to do the opposite and create instant dungeon layouts. Not only does this obviously speed up the generation process, but it also should hopefully be more efficient in the long run. The main reason, however, is I would like to improve the quality of my random generation code in the future. For example, using noise algorithms to determine more realistic or varied layout designs, or just stuff that generally feels more organic. But to get there, we have to abandon the old way of generating our content. So first thing up was defining the world grid. For the sake of simplicity, I went with 16 by 16 cells. A room variable was added to control how many rooms we generate per dungeon. Following that would be variables for X and Y coordinates and a direction. Then, as a test, I had the code mark the center of the grid as occupied 100 times, the same amount of times as rooms we want to generate. And to reflect those actions, using a simple loop, a tile would be drawn in the occupied spaces. And if you've been following along with recent episodes, you know that this worked just as it should have. A single tile in our room was drawn, and if we could peel those back, there would definitely be 100 of them stacked on top of one another. So with that working, we now had to make things move. Back in the code, more variables were added to shift our coordinate variables based on the directional variable. Very similar to what we've been doing in previous generation attempts, only we're using just variables to determine our paths. So for testing purposes, the path was defaulted to the right, and to the right the path would go for 100 16 by 16 tiles. Adding back in the random element allowed the path to shoot in a random 90-degree angle with each reset of the room, meaning that so far we haven't broken anything. Amazing. Back in the code, I then had the direction changed for every instance, which not only varied up the generation a lot, but pretty much did what all of our old methods did, but did it all in a single frame. However, off to the side, I noticed sometimes the generation would surpass the grid borders, so clamps were added to restrict generation to remain within the grid. Then, to add some longer hallways to the generation, a random chance was added to the direction switching. So with a roughly 10% chance of switching, the results showed generation featuring a ton of long hallways. Not the most visually appealing, so tweaking the chances eventually landed us some pretty nice randomly generated chunks. And so to add more variation, I wanted to use GameMaker's DS Grid Disk feature. By defining a certain radius, I was hoping that this would allow us to end up with pathways of varying thicknesses. However, things didn't go as planned. Instead, chunks of generated world were just missing, and when displaying each cell's data showed I misunderstood the function. Instead of setting up a radius of data, I was simply adding to it. So, defeated and with no energy to fight it, I nixed the idea. Instead, I'd use a size variable and a loop to generate randomly sized square chunks. The results weren't awful, but clearly very blocky in nature. And originally, that's where this episode would have ended. However, while putting this video together, I decided to try one last thing, so back to the code we went. I decided to try the disk code one last time. However, in the tile check portion, the value of the grid would be clamped, so anything over 1 would still be counted as 1, thus making the original disk idea viable again. And viable it, well, kind of was. The discs generated weren't the smoothest, but they were definitely welcomed over the chunky squares. Speaking of which, just to throw all caution into the wind, the chunky squares were added back into the spawn code via switch. The results were even weirder, with a mixture of large, small, blocky, and round. Generally a chaotic mix of everything. And just to see if anything significant would happen, I then repeated the repeat code, increasing our randomness to even higher levels of random. Unfortunately, the end results weren't as crazy as I was hoping, but a few tweaks to the randomness ended up giving us some pretty cool results. Some of the layouts even felt reminiscent of the caves that I see in Terraria, or as a level in something like Nuclear Throne. So while we haven't reached noise algorithm levels yet, I'm liking what we managed to come up with just using basic math. And real talk, I can't imagine just how much cooler this would look if I was capable of advanced math. One day. For now, that'll just remain a dream. And that also brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on this little generation prototype in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.